The spirit catches you and you fall down. A Hmong child, her American doctors, and the collision of two cultures. Author Anne Fadiman. Fish soup. In an intermediate French class at Merced College a few years ago, the students were assigned a 5-minute oral report to be delivered in French. The second student to stand up in front of the class was a young Hmong man. His chosen topic was a recipe for la soupe de poisson, fish soup. To prepare fish soup, he said, you must have a fish. And in order to have a fish, you have to go fishing. And in order to go fishing, you need a hook. And in order to choose the right hook, you need to know whether the fish you are fishing for lives in fresh or salt water, how big it is, and what shape its mouth is. Continuing in this vein for 45 minutes, the students filled the blackboard with a complexly branching tree of factors and options. A sort of piscatory flowchart written in French with an overlay of Hmong. He also told several anecdotes about his own fishing experiences. He concluded with a description of how to clean various kinds of fish, how to cut them up, and finally how to cook them in both flavors with various herbs. When the class period ended, he told the other students that he hoped he had provided enough information, and he wished them good luck in preparing fish soup in the Hmong manner. The professor of French who told me this story said, fish soup, that's the essence of the Hmong. The Hmong have a phrase, high score sup come sup, which means to speak of all kinds of things. It's often used at the beginning of an oral narrative as a way of reminding the listeners that the world is full of things that may not seem to be connected but actually are, that no event occurs in isolation, that you can miss a lot by sticking to the point, and that the storyteller is likely to be rather long-winded. I once heard Nao Li begin a description of his village in Laos by saying, it was where I was born, and where my father was born, and died and was buried, and where my father's father died and was buried. But my father's father was born in China, and to tell you about that would take all night. If a Hmong tells a fable, for example, about why animals cannot talk, or why do bugs roll balls of dung, he is likely to begin with the beginning of the world. Actually, according to Dap Nek Moop, Myths, Legend and Folktales from the Hmong of Laos, a bilingual collection edited by Charles Johnson, those two fables go back only to the second beginning of the world, the time after the universe turned upside down and the earth was flooded with water and everyone drowned except a brother and sister who married each other and had a child who looked like an axe, whom they hacked into small pieces. If I were Hmong, I might feel that what happened when Laya Lee and her family encountered the American medical system could be understood fully only by beginning with the first beginning of the world. But since I'm not Hmong, I'll go back only a few hundred generations to the time when the Hmong were living in the river plains of North Central China. For as long as it has been recorded, the history of the Hmong has been a marathon series of bloody scrimmages, punctuated by occasional periods of peace, though hardly any of plenty. Over and over again, the Hmong have responded to persecutions and to pressures to assimilate by either fighting or migrating, a pattern that has been repeated so many times, in so many different eras and places, that it begins to seem almost a genetic trait, as inevitable in its recurrence as their straight hair or their short, sturdy stature. Most of the conflicts took place in China, to which the prehistoric ancestors of the Hmong are thought to have migrated from Eurasia, with a stopover a few millennia in Siberia. These northerly routes would explain the references in Hmong rituals, including some that are still practiced during the New Year celebrations and at funerals, to a Hmong homeland called Tuskap Wap, which, according to a 1924 accounting by Francois Marie Savina, a French apostolic missionary who served in Laos and Tonkin, was perpetually covered with snow and ice. Where the days and the nights each lasted for 6 months, the trees were scarce and very small, and the people were also very small and dressed entirely in furs. European ancestry would also explain why the Hmong have fairer skin than other Asian peoples, no epicanthic folds beneath their eyelids, and sometimes big noses. It would not explain why Suma Chian, a Chinese scholar of the Han Dynasty in the 2nd century BC, described the Hmong as a race whose face, eyes, feet, and hands resembled those of other people, but under their armpits they had wings, with which, however, they were unable to fly. It would also fail to explain why, as late as the 19th century, many Chinese claimed that the Hmong had small tails. The Chinese called the Hmong the Mao or Mao, which means, depending on which linguistic historian you would read, barbarians, pumpkins, people who sound like cats, or wild uncultivated grasses. In any case, it was an insult. Hmong, the name they prefer themselves, is usually said to mean free men, but some scholars say that, like Inuit, Dine, and many other tribal names the world over, it simply means the people. The Hmong call the Chinese sons of dogs. The Chinese view the Hmong as fearless and count and recalcitrant. It was a continuing slap in the face that they never evinced any interest in adopting the civilized custom of Chinese culture, preference to keep to themselves, marry each other, speak their own language, wear their own tribal dress, play their own musical instruments, and practice their own religion. They never even eat with chopsticks. The Hmong viewed the Chinese as meddlesome and oppressive, and rebelled against their sovereignty in hundreds of small and large revolts. Though both sides were equally violent, it was not a symmetrical relationship. The Hmong never had any interest in ruling over the Chinese or anyone else. They wanted merely to be left alone, which, as their later history was also to illustrate, may be the most difficult request any minority can make of a majority culture. The earliest account of Hmong-Chinese relations concerns are probably mythical, but emotionally resonant. An emperor named Huang Di, who was said to have lived around 2700 BC, Huang Di decided that Hmong were too barbaric to be governed by the same laws as everyone else, and that they would henceforth be subject to a special criminal code. Instead of being imprisoned like other offenders, the Hmong who were not executed outright were to have their noses, ears, or testicles sliced off. The Hmongs rebelled. The Chinese cracked down. The Hmong rebelled again. The Chinese cracked down again, and after a few centuries of this, the Hmong gradually retreated from their rice fields in the valleys of the Yangtze and Yellow rivers, moving to more and more southerly latitudes and higher altitudes. That is how the Mao became mountain people, wrote Father Savina. That is also how they were able to preserve their independence in the midst of other peoples, maintaining in fact along with their language and their customs, the ethnic spirits of their race. Around AD 400, the Hmong succeeded in establishing an independent kingdom in the Honan, Hubei, and Hunan provinces. Since even among themselves they were, as Father Jean Martin, a modern French missionary in Thailand, has put it, allergic to all kind of authority. The power of their kings was limited by a complex system of village and district assemblies. Though the crown was hereditary, each new king was chosen from among the former king's sons by an electorate of all the arms-bearing men in the kingdom. Since the Hmong practiced polygyny and kings had an especially large number of wives, the pool of candidates was usually ample enough to afford an almost democratically wide choice. The Hmong kingdom lasted for 500 years before the Chinese managed to crush it. Most of the Hmong migrated again, this time toward the west, to the mountains of Guizhou and Sichuan. More insurrections followed. Some Hmong warriors were known for using poisoned arrows. Others went into battle dressed in coppers and buffalo hide armor, carrying knives clenched between their teeth, in addition to the usual spears and shields. Some Hmong's crossbows were so big it took 3 men to draw them. In the 16th century, in order to keep the Hmong from venturing outside Guizhou, the Ming dynasty constructed the Hmong Wall, a smaller version of the Great Wall of China, that was 100 miles long, 10 feet tall, and manned by armed guards. For a time the Hmong were contained, but not controlled. Gabriel de Magalhães, a Jesuit missionary who traveled through China in the 17th century, wrote that they pay no tribute to the emperor, nor yield him any obedience. The Chinese stand in fear of them, so that after several trials which they have made of their prowess, they have been forced to let them live at their own liberty. The Chinese tried to pacify and cynicize the Hmong by telling them that they had to surrender their arms, that they had to wear Chinese clothes, that the men had to cut their hair short, and that they were forbidden to sacrifice buffaloes. Those who submitted were called the cooked male. Those who refused were the raw male. There were a lot more raw male than cooked ones. In 1730 of thereabout, hundreds of Hmong warriors killed their wives and children, believing they would fight more fiercely if they had nothing to lose. It worked for a while. Thus, unencumbered, they seized several passes, serving Chinese supply lines before they themselves were all killed or captured. In 1772, a small army of Hmong squashed a large army of Chinese in eastern Guizhou by rolling boulders off their head while they were marching through a narrow gorge. The Manchu Emperor Qianlong decided he would be satisfied with nothing less than the exterminations and the entire Hmong tribe, a goal whose unsuccessful pursuit ultimately cost him twice what he had spent conquering the entire kingdom of Turkestan. Qianlong dispatched another general to the Hmong regions. After many months of sieges and battles, the general told Sonam, the Hmong king of Greater Qin Chuan, that if he surrendered, his family would be spared. Sonam swallowed the story. When he and his family were brought before the emperor, they were chopped into bits, and their heads were placed in cages for public exhibition. It is, perhaps, no surprise that by the beginning of the 19th century, a large number of Hmong decided that they had had enough of China. Not only were they fed up with being persecuted, their soul was also getting depleted. there was a rash of epidemics, and taxes were rising, although the majority of the Hmong stayed behind. Today, there are about 5 million Hmong in China, more than in any other country. About 500,000 migrated to Indochina, walking the ridge lines, driving their horses and cattle ahead of them, carrying everything they owned. As was their custom, they went to the highlands, settling first in what are now Vietnam and Laos, and later in Thailand, for the most part, to build their villages and places where no one else wanted to live. But if the local tribes objected or demanded tribute, the Hmong fought back with the flintlock blunderbusses or with their fists, and usually won. Father Montin quotes an official who said, "I saw a male take my son by the feet of Breck, his spine against the post of my hut." After the French established control over Indochina in the 1890s, the Hmong rebelled against their extortionate tax system in a series of revolts. One of them, called the Madman's War, which lasted from 1919 to 1921, was led by a Masonic figure named Pache, who had a habit of climbing trees so that he could receive his military orders directly from heaven. His followers blew away large numbers of colonial soldiers with 10-foot-long cannons made from tree trunks. Only after the French granted them special administrative status in 1920, acknowledging that the best way to avoid being driven crazy by them was to leave them alone, did the Hmong of Laos, who constituted the largest group outside China, settle down peaceably through several unbroken decades of farming mountains rice, growing opium, and having as little contact as possible with the French, the Lowland Lao, or any of the other ethnic groups who lived at lower elevations. The history of the Hmong yields several lessons that anyone who deals with them might do well to remember. Among the most obvious of these are the Hmong do not like to take others, that they do not like to lose, that they would rather flee, fight, or die than surrender, that they are not intimidated by being outnumbered, that they are really persuaded that the customs of other cultures, even those more powerful than their own, are superior, and that they are capable of getting very angry. Whether you find these traits infuriating or admirable depends largely on whether or not you are trying to make a Hmong do something he or she would prefer not to do. Those who have tried to defeat, deceive, govern, regulate, constrain, assimilate, intimidate, or patronize the Hmong have, as a rule, dislike them intensely. On the other hand, many historians, anthropologists, and missionaries to whom the Hmong have usually been polite, if not always receptive, as long as the proselytizing has not been coercive, have developed a great fondness for them. Father Savina wrote that Hmong possessed a bravery and courage inferior to that of no other people, because of which they have never had a homeland, but neither have they ever known servitude and slavery. William Robert Geddes, an Australian anthropologist, spent most of 1958 and 1959 in Pasem Liam, a Hmong village in northern Thailand, though more Hmong lived in Laos and Vietnam. Most Western observers in the last half-century or so have worked in Thailand because of its stabler political situation. Geddes did not find his field work easy. The villagers were too proud to sell him food, so he had to transport his supplies by pack horse. Nor would they allow themselves to be hired to build him a house. So he had to employ opium addicts from a Thai village lower down the mountain. However, the monk eventually won his deep respect. In his book Migrants of the Mountains, Geddes wrote, the preservation by the Maya of their ethnic identity for such a long time, despite their being split into many small groups surrounded by different alien peoples and scattered over a vast geographic area, is an outstanding record, paralleling in some ways that of the Jews, but more remarkable because they lacked the unifying forces of literacy and the doctrinal religions, and because the features they reserve seems to be more numerous. Robert Cooper, a British anthropologist who spent 2 years studying resource scarcities in 4 Hmong communities in northern Thailand, described his research subject as polite with fawning, proud but not arrogant, hospitable without being pushy, discreet respecters of personal liberty who demand only that their liberty be respected in return, people who do not steal or lie, self-sufficient people who showed no trace of jealousies of an outsider, who said he wanted to live like a monk yet owned an expensive motorcycle, a tape recorder, cameras, and who never had to work for a living. From his post in the Hmong village of Kek Noi, also in northern Thailand, Father Martin wrote in his History of the Hmong, a wonderful book, exuberantly translated from the French by an Irish nun who had once been the tutor of the future king of Thailand, and printed rather faintly in Bangkok. Though they are but a small people, the Hmong still prove to be great men. What particularly strikes me is to see how this small race has always managed to survive, though they often had to face more powerful nations. Let us consider, for example, that the Chinese were 250 times more numerous than they, and yet never found their way to swallow them. The Hmong have never possessed a country of their own. They have never got a king worthy of this name, and yet they have passed through the ages remaining what they have always wished to be, that is to say, free men with a right to live in this world as Hmong. Who would not admire them for that? One of the recurring characters in Hmong folktales is the orphan, a young man whose parents have died, leaving him alone to live by his wits. In one story, collected by Charles Johnson, the orphan offers the hospitality of his humble home to 2 sisters, one good and one snotty. The snotty one says, "What, with a 50 orphan boy like you? You're so wrecked you're almost naked. Your panties is dirty with ashes. You must eat on the ground and sleep in the mud like a buffalo. I don't think you even have any drink or tobacco to offer us." The orphan may not have a clean penis, but he is a clever, energetic, brave, persistent, and a virtuoso player of the keys, a musical instrument, highly esteemed by the Hmong, that is made from 6 curving bamboo pipes attached to a wooden wind chamber. Though he lives by himself on the margins of society, revealed by almost everyone, he knows in his heart that he is actually superior to all his detractors. Charles Johnson points out that the orphan is, of course, a symbol of the Hmong people. In this story, the orphan marries the good sister, who is able to perceive his true value, and they prosper and have children. The snotty sister ends up married to the cat of death, who lives in a cave, drinks blood, and makes women sterile.